This video contains spoilers for both Life is Strange and Life is Strange 2. The subject matter is sensitive and there is graphic imagery. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey you guys, my name is Asmara and the Life is Strange 2 commentary is finally here. It's been a minute to get these videos up. I've said this a few times on the channel, but these videos are very mentally exhausting, the ones where I explore social issues, and also sometimes doing commentary YouTube can just be annoying. You have an issue with annoying commenters, rude commenters, which fortunately does not happen often, but it's enough to kind of, put you off. Also, with being a commentary YouTube, there's this feeling of like having to do everything right and say everything perfectly, because people on the internet can be brutal, like they're so perfect. Even despite, all that goes with creating commentary content on YouTube, I really want to make these videos with the for the benefit of others and with the intention to center and highlight marginalized voices. And so with this video, I really hope to center the Mexican American experience, or the experience of Latinx immigrants in the United States. So I hope that comes off through the editing and through just the way I formatted this script. So because the intent of this video was really to highlight and center marginalized voices, if you experience anything that I talk about in this video and have anything you'd like to add, please, comment below if you feel comfortable with doing so. I'd love to engage in civil conversation and just have this be a place where we can safely discuss these topics and learn and grow together. But on that note, because this is the internet and this is YouTube, we got a couple rules for the comment section. As this channel has slowly grown over these past several months, I've had an increase of gaslighting and just disrespectful comments on my more analytical videos where I talk about social issues, the nature of the internet. And from here on out, gaslighting comments will be clapped. You're just gonna be put into the YouTube abyss. So, leave all your unwanted comments in a box to the left. And that goes for any of the experiences I talk in this video. If you're gonna be disrespectful to me or to anybody else in my community, you being clapped. With that being said, let's go ahead and begin my thoughts and commentary on the various sociocultural issues discussed and explored in Life is Strange 2. "16-year-old Sean Diaz is orphaned along with his 9-year-old brother Daniel after a tragic, racist encounter with law enforcement kills their father, followed by a mysterious blast that becomes fatal for the acclaimed Seattle police officer. Panicked, Sean runs away with his little brother to start a new life. They head to Puerto Lobos, Mexico, where their father owns a small plot of land, hoping there they'll be safe. On their strenuous journey from the city to the country and even the desert, they overcome great feats, uncover a supernatural power, and meet all kinds of people that shape their experience on the road and the young men they are becoming." So that was a brief plot synopsis of the game. By the way, there are people doing construction outside. I swear every time I start recording videos, people will be like doing construction, everybody be mowing their lawn. So I'm sorry if you can hear that. But that was a brief synopsis of the game. And one of the biggest overarching themes about Life is Strange 2 is this idea of being the other or being displaced. One of the ways this game explores that theme is through homelessness, having various representations of characters who are homeless or live sort of wandering, unconventional lifestyles. Obviously, we have, our protagonists, Sean and Daniel. They're homeless right off the bat. Their father gets killed from, a racial profiling incident with law enforcement, and they're basically kind of ostracized from being considered these, criminals, these murderers, these thugs, presumably from their Mexican American identity. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have characters like Brody, who came from a rich, high-class lifestyle, but decided to take a more unconventional, wandering path by becoming a journalist, or he says a traveling journalist, writing blogs, protesting, etc. So he desires to sort of roam and be creative, separate from the really structured and safe lifestyle that he came from. Obviously, we have the drifters who are all homeless for one reason or another. This is something I actually had to go back through my Let's Play and find, actually re-listen to the dialogues about the stories of everybody. In my playthrough, honestly, I got kind of bored in episode 3 because it was just a lot of dialogue. I'm not gonna lie. But going back, I learned a lot more about each of these characters. We have like Cassidy, who had like a drug addicted racist father, and then her mother was complacent in this sort of racism against her boyfriend at that time. Her family, which is overall sort of emotionally abusive. And there's all sorts of other stories from the drifters. Finn, his dad was a snitch, so he went to jail for his dad's illegal business. We have Hannah, who had an alcoholic mother and was abusing her money. Penny was kind of always ostracized for his identity in his hometown. Jacob, since he was gay in this like highly religious sort of culty environment, you know, that didn't fly with Mama Deacon Elizabeth. And we have Ingrid and Arthurs, who are travelers from Europe. So of the drifters, you can already see the array of different type of stories we have of homeless people. And of course, when we get later into the plot, we see stories with like Karen, who was tired of following the rules and just wanted to sort of pave her own path in life. And where Karen now lives, the commune, all the different characters from Away have their own stories. And so this topic of homelessness is definitely something seldom spoken of, especially when it comes to youth homelessness. And so I think Life is Strange 2 definitely tackled this idea of displacement with the homelessness, I think pretty well, by showing an array of different lifestyles and reasons why people decide to take up unconventional paths. I also want to emphasize that people who are homeless or become homeless don't necessarily want to choose that lifestyle or want that life, you know, to begin with, but they often feel like they have to for one reason or another, and those reasons can run the gamut. So I don't want to come across as like homelessness is a choice, because more often than not, people don't really want that life, you know? One of the intentions from one of the developers was saying that they wanted to show different types of outcasts in society.
They will face a lot of various difficult situations where we just want to show to the players just a big picture of the rural America, the different kind of outcasts and different kind of characters you could meet on the road.
Through these various people that we met on the road, you can definitely see that. One of my viewers named Alex, he answered my Google survey as I was getting research for this video, and he says, it was really interesting throughout the game. You can see the way some people tend to treat homeless people. Most of the time, they're treated as if they don't exist. And then on the Life is Strange 2's official channel, on a fundraiser they were doing for this youth homelessness charity in the UK, I found this comment. Hey, as someone who left home to escape an abusive family, who slept on subways, benches, and in ditches as a teenager, thank you guys. So this person is obviously expressing, you know, their gratitude for sort of having an experience that could resonate to some extent, you know, reflected in this game. So I think Life is Strange 2 definitely helped to destigmatize sort of how we view homelessness. The second main way we start to see this idea of being the other or being excluded in Life is Strange 2 is obviously through the discrimination, the racism, the xenophobia, and just this overall idea of being powerless in those circumstances. The antagonists of this game are honestly structures of power and security. When those two things get lost, seemingly, it results in a lack of compassion, an emphasis on tradition, as well as both physical and verbal attacks. And the primary enemy that Sean and Daniel face on the road is xenophobia. So before we get too far in the script, I really want to start by defining the difference between racism and xenophobia. This is something I'm still sort of, you know, understanding, but there is a difference, and I do want to make that distinction. So racism is the belief of the natural superiority of one race over another. It's basically prejudice or discrimination against another group of people because they're of a different race or ethnicity. So racism, as I understand it, is more so structured in like power and systemic systems that keep people oppressed, and it's based on this idea that one group is better or superior than another. Whereas xenophobia, on the other hand, is defined as the aversion or fear of foreigners, people from different cultures, or strangers. So I think xenophobia is definitely rooted in racism, but the reason I want to, you know, make this distinction and make it a point is because when it comes to Latinx people who are from Latin America, there are a ton of different races of people who live in Latin America. But what unites them is their cultural similarities, their ethnicity. Being Latin American is more so an ethnicity than a race, but there are races of Latin American people, if that makes sense. I'm gonna try my best to use the word xenophobia so I can, be correct in that. However, I do definitely see how xenophobia is like part of racism or really rooted in racism. I might use them interchangeably, but I just wanted to, make that distinction. I'm still sort of trying to understand the difference. So if you guys like have any other definitions or ways to help me kind of better process this, go ahead and leave it in the comments. I'm sure other people find that beneficial as well. Xenophobia, definitely a big reoccurring theme in Life is Strange 2. So the good thing about including themes like xenophobia, it creates a feeling of empathy. Obviously, people who play these games are in the shoes of, this Mexican American boys and are experiencing, the discrimination firsthand. And so games like this give an opportunity to create empathy for an experience that you may not relate to or have close, experience with or proximity to. So good or bad, the story can show some of the harsh realities of what it's like to be born in brown skin. Another one of my viewers, Gabby, she wrote, I believe that games include these types of topics are so impactful, especially since games like Life is Strange are so character focused where you feel strongly connected to the character and their decision and life experience. It opens an opportunity for players to gain a little glimpse of a life different from their own. Another one of my viewers, Jackson, he writes, I am not an American, so this gave me more insight into social issues I wasn't very aware of, like immigration in the United States. So here we have two examples of people showing how empathy can really be one of the biggest takeaways and biggest impacts of creating games like this and exploring these issues. Now on to the bad, or maybe a better word would be complicated, by almost exclusively focusing on overt expressions of racism and also never really analyzing the deeper implications or the systemic issues revolving these attacks. Dontnod clearly wanted to bring attention to this subject and to this happening, but never really went deeper than that basic surface level acknowledgement. And I honestly think this was one of the developers' intentions. If you go ahead and check out this clip from 2019 PAX West, this is a panel talking about their intention to just bring awareness to these type of issues.
The problem is everything in the game exists. So maybe at times for people it feels a little too much, but I think the point of that is to just call attention to it.
And so that could have very much been their intention, but the xenophobia and racism really could have been more further explored to seem less like, the xenophobia and racism was like just the cherry on top that they sprinkled onto this road trip story that they wanted to tell.
Life is Strange was about relatable characters, about talking about social issues and difficult themes. We don't start to create the game by choosing the themes. We start by imagine the stories, imagine all the cool scenes we can share and we can have in the game, and after that we put some themes we want to explore on the top of it.
A lot of the game really felt like they wanted to show you that, hey, racism exists or xenophobia exists and people are trash and will attack people in the streets. But honestly, apart from that initial acknowledgement, there's really no deeper exploration of these topics and how complex and nuanced being a victim of discrimination, xenophobia, and dehumanization is. It doesn't really go deeper into exploring how these boys are processing being dehumanized. Now, also, we have to realize that the people who wrote this game and the people who directed them are two white French males. And as a consumer, I personally do not expect someone from that background to really understand, I guess, the nuance and complexities of these issues and how it works in the United States. From what I understand from the research and interviews and articles I've read from the development team, they had people on staff, such as narrative designers, to help, with things like the Spanish language to make sure they were using Spanish words correctly. Apparently they also talked to people at the border when they were doing research for this game. But to me, it just doesn't seem like they really did research about just what it's like to just exist as a Mexican American. It almost felt like they were prioritizing discrimination over their actual Mexican identity. And obviously this game also takes place in 2016, so I don't know if I should say his name, post 45th President of the United States era, and these tensions were very high. I'm gonna read you guys an excerpt from Patricia Hernandez. This person wrote an article for Polygon in 2020. They are Mexican American, and they actually talked about in the article that their mom crossed the border in real life. And so this is them, reflecting on their experience being Mexican American and addressing how they feel about the way they sort of approached this idea of discrimination from, a Mexican American standpoint. So Patricia writes, based on my experience, this approach feels crass. For me, racism isn't always a direct confrontation where a bigot threatens me with violence or even outright mentions my background. It's often where things are implied, but maybe not outright said. It's noticing the slight alarm in a rich white person's voice when I tell them I got into the same private school as their child. It's being asked if I'm some white boy's nanny. It's being the single brown person in a room. It's a matter of what documents that say whether I can belong. It's knowing that, regardless of what the government might say, what it actually does has nothing to do with the law. It's a lifetime of toothpick stabs. Another one of my viewers, Ritos Gale, he is also Mexican American, and he writes, while name calling and using racial slurs definitely happens, the far right has increasingly evolved its racist rhetoric to consist mostly of dog whistles and subtle language that comes off as racist if you understand the underlying message. Examples include how the man said at the gas station, Hank Stamper, "You're the reason why we need to build that wall," as the build the wall rhetoric is a blatantly racist dog whistle, meaning we want to keep Latin American migrants out of our white country. So I think both of those excerpts were very well said. Both Ritos Gale and Patricia Hernandez touch on this idea of dog whistles and microaggressions. There's various other examples of microaggressions throughout the plot, and it starts at the very beginning, like in the house when you just first start the game and you see a letter that says, "I know my rights as a US citizen, maybe you don't," directed towards the Diaz family, implying that as someone who is from Latin descent, they cannot possibly be American, or they're a foreigner, they're an other. So that's an example of a microaggression. And even in episode 2 with Claire, there was a scene where she implies that there is more crime in the city than there is in the country, and it being safer, quote unquote, in the country. That can definitely be seen as a dog whistle, because when you're saying there's more crime in the city, what is implied is that there are black and brown people and urban neighborhoods are all dangerous. Dog whistles are definitely important for kind of understanding the context of the language we use societally and how language matters when we're talking also about discrimination and topics like this. But I would not be doing my job if I didn't look at these issues from all different angles. So let's contradict myself for a minute. We've established that Life is Strange 2 does not thoroughly fully explore the nuance of racism in this game. They more so prioritize the physical aggressors and attackers throughout this plot. But are we being too harsh on Life is Strange 2? Let's think about it. This game came out in 2018. 2020 hadn't happened yet. I feel like post-2020 world, people are more understanding that racism is a little bit more nuanced. Obviously not everybody, but like post-2020, our understanding of race, I feel like as a culture has definitely changed or is starting to change. People are actually being forced to think about it more. This is something that I don't think really has been tackled in a mainstream video game. How effectively did they tackle it for the time being? One of my viewers, Jaden, he says, I feel like Life is Strange 2 approached everything more effectively for its release than people were willing to admit to. The game came out in 2018, and people loved retorting that it was unrealistic, that it wasn't accurate, and that it was being forced on how bad these issues were. I've come to really appreciate and love Life is Strange 2 a lot for what it is, and for talking about what nobody wanted to discuss at the time. And then another one of my community members, JB, he says, While not perfect, I think Life is Strange 2 does an overall good job exploring its themes like racism. It's one of the few games that unapologetically tackles racism in a present-day, real-world setting instead of a fantastical or futuristic setting. That's a good point. If you watch my video about Detroit Become Human, I'm gonna link it. That's another video that kind of explores this idea of social issues and civil rights. But anyways, back to what he was saying. The situations presented in the game are blunt but realistic. There are a lot of complaints about how racism isn't subtle or nuanced, but racism is not always subtle, especially in a post-Trump America. And while the game does tend to show more extreme cases of racism, it does explore more subtle forms of racism. And he gives some examples like the ones I was giving earlier. But again, you would only really, I feel like, see them more if you're conscious of these ideas and if you're conscious of internal biases that people already have and how that manifests itself in language if you are also of a certain identity group. So the microaggressions definitely exist, but why are there so many blatantly racist attacks in this game? So from doing some research from the developing team, I watched a lot of interviews and read a lot of articles from the people who worked behind the scenes on this story. And from my research, it seems to me that the reason they included so many blatantly racist attacks is that when these French studio directors came to the United States on the road trip to do research for this game, they talked to people who lived along the US and Mexican border and talked about some of the issues they were facing. And some of the people have expressed actually being physically attacked crossing the border. Since this is like something they came across in their research for this video, that is likely why they included so many blatantly racist attacks, because that's just all they knew. And we talked about that earlier. Being a part of a racial or ethnic minority is not always physical altercations, but it's more so just the reality of how people perceive you. It's sort of the burden of your own family and what they've had to go through to give you, you know, the life that you live. And this can go for, you know, any immigrant family. But it's a lot less cookie cutter, as if being Mexican American means I'm going to be attacked in the streets, which that definitely happens. So I'm not saying this is not untrue, but I would not expect a white French studio director coming to the United States being able to absorb all of that experience and reality in just a trip. And again, they did have some Latin American people on their production team, more so like doing the narrative design and making sure the Spanish language was good. And I don't know how else they were involved in the actual process. Again, this is just from the research I've done. Latin American developers could have been more involved. I do not know because I was not there, but this is just my perception as a consumer, as someone who is sort of on the outside looking in. I just don't really feel like they got really to the heart of the Mexican American experience. They instead wanted to focus on discrimination and not really like the people, if that makes sense. That's just kind of how it seemed to me. And I do think it would have been more beneficial for these French directors to use their platform and privilege to allow Latinx people and Mexican American people to speak more directly into the game, so that they can reflect that experience, that everyday experience beyond discrimination and them speaking Spanish. In essence, my final thoughts about how this game decided to tackle xenophobia and discrimination. I do like that these boys were still able to be human beyond these xenophobic hate crimes that they encountered. I do like that they did not make the whole game about them, you know, being attacked. In my comments, JB, he also writes, I don't feel that this game tackling racism took away from or overpowers the characters. It's a constant present in the background, but Sean and Daniel are more than the racism they face, and the game focuses more on their growth, their brotherhood, more than anything else. And so I definitely agree with that. I do appreciate how they did not just make discrimination the defining factor of their experience. We can still be human and find joy beyond the discriminations we face. And again, I also really do like how this game put these themes in a real world contemporary setting instead of a fantastical or futuristic setting, proving the point that these issues are happening right here, right now. Ritos Gale, he also writes, I appreciated that the game begins by displaying how racism still permeates in the Pacific Northwest, despite the fact that states like Oregon and Washington are frequently hailed for progressive policies. The game makes it very clear that at various points that white supremacy is embedded in American culture and not just in rural areas, but also in progressive and urban cities like Seattle. However, I don't like how the game did not really place any emphasis or did not explore any of these psychological or sort of physiological effects of sort of being victims of these xenophobic hate crimes. Like, let's just call it what it is. These attacks are never explored in this game, despite xenophobia and discrimination obviously being a key element of these boys' lives. My thoughts would be different if xenophobia and discrimination was not supposed to be a key facet of this game. If the discrimination was just, subject to a specific scene or specific dialogue, I don't think I would be as critical, again, of this depiction because, again, I don't really expect people from this sort of background to understand the nuances and complexities of racism, but this game obviously wanted to make a point that, hey, these racists out here do exist. And this is something prevalent in these boys' lives. That's 5 attacks, at least major ones in this game. And it just not being any further explored beyond just showing its presence in these boys' lives just does not sit right with me. And the fact that they don't get to process it throughout the game, because for 2 scared boys on the run, I know that's not like healthy to be dehumanized in this way, and that's definitely a way they could have developed greater emotional depth for these characters, Sean and Daniel, and even grown closer together as brothers. Them being attacked is honestly just kind of things that happen, and they aren't like explored any deeper beyond that. And I know I keep saying that, I'm trying to like find different language to use, but it's just very surface level and brushed over, and it looks like they just see the Mexican American experience or the experience of being a person of color as just being subject to racist attacks and discriminatory acts physically or verbally, but never examine how it feels internally. The one time I feel like we've got to see Sean just acknowledge, hey, this sucks, being the victim of all these hate crimes, is after the episode 4 attack from Chad and Mike, where he just screams fuck in the car driving home or driving to go get Daniel. That's like the one time we actually get to see him acknowledge that, hey, this sucks. And I just wish there was more of that. Like, I wish there was room for these boys, these brown boys, to be able to express how they're processing this, how they're experiencing this. And I get there's a lot of stuff happening in their lives, so this game kind of has to go from one thing to the next. But again, this is a 20-hour game. If you're going to show us people getting attacked and, these aggressors, these overt racists, I want to see more from the boys so we can even empathize more with them through that way. I think that would be even more beneficial for people without color to see sort of these harsh realities. The majority of people who are playing Life is Strange 2 are not these aggressors, are not these racist, attackers. Those people are not playing this game and seeing how it is dehumanizing. Kaz in my comment section, they make a lot of different points about this game, but I'm gonna go ahead and read one point he made about this sort of, brushing over of the discrimination. So they say, Sean's father is killed by police brutality, and we constantly see racism throughout the entire game, but it's never the system presented as the problem. It's always the individual racists and the police, and not the entire country's history of white supremacy and racism. These events aren't unpacked. They're just things that happen. Things happen, bad things happen, but they're never the fault of the system. And so again, that's another example of how I think they could have further explored how again, the aggressors are not these few people, but it's a system rooted in white supremacy that results in xenophobic hate crimes, in the fear of the other. The same force that makes you think that Black and Latino men are scary and criminals and murderers, that same prejudice can express itself in a microaggression. That same microaggression where you might think that a Latin American person can't understand you if you're, speaking English. That same prejudice that may seem small is literally rooted in the same system that allows these larger attacks to happen. It's the prejudice, the perceived notion that people who are not white are other and un-American. Again, I just wish this game would have shown that, because again, I feel like that would have been beneficial for the target audience and the people who play these games. And as a quick aside, to sort of show that Life is Strange, and I believe that Dontnod is capable of exploring these topics more thoroughly, is let's take a look at Life is Strange 1. The social issues in Life is Strange 1 were more so side plots, you know, like we have a plot with Chloe and her dad, Chloe sort of learning how to get over grief and her sort of acting out in rebellion, and the David not seeing eye to eye. That's sort of like a side story about, you know, dealing with grief and trauma in growing up. And then we have another side story with Kate Marsh, who is dealing with cyberbullying and being harassed, being slut shamed for this, you know, video that went viral. But even though those sort of social issues are more minor plots, you can see in let's take Kate's situation, for example, how the cyberbullying and Kate getting to this place where she's, you know, considering committing suicide is a chain reaction from different events happening in her life. The person who did the drugging and, you know, took this video in the first place is never shown as just being the direct influence of Kate's decline. It's also the people, the teachers and the other students who are slut shaming her, who are sharing these videos, links. It's shown as a collective effort to drive someone to the place where they feel sort of lonely and hopeless. And again, Life is Strange 1 is not perfect by any means, and reading your comments and your feedback, I can see you guys have also different opinions about how they decided to tackle this issue. But that's something I wish that they would have done more in Life is Strange 2, because with racism and xenophobia and discrimination just overall being like the main plot, you know, as I said earlier, the antagonists of this game are structures of power and security. There are ways that collectively as a human race that we contribute to these systems that are harmful and dehumanizing to people of color, and in this situation, Mexican American people, Latinx immigrants. I wish it would have allowed these brown boys, these boys of color, to express their pain and have a human reaction to being dehumanized, which is something Black and brown kids are often robbed of. The next thing I want to talk about is how this game depicted Mexico, emigration and immigration, and also just the overall Mexican American identity. This is obviously going to have some overlap from what we've already discussed, but I also wanted to make its own topic because I have some thoughts about how they depicted Mexico throughout this game. For starters, I'm very iffy about the way Life is Strange 2 depicted Mexico as only really a place to flee from. An example is with Carla and Diego at the end of the game.
En realidad, queremos llegar a México.
¿A México? No mames. ¿Pero por qué? Entonces son gringos.
Sí, nacimos aquí, pero ahora tenemos que irnos.
Es la tercera vez que intentamos cruzar la frontera. Me acuerdo de nuestra primera vez. Casi morimos de sed en el desierto.
¿No están cansados de intentar?
No tenemos otra opción. Y seguiremos intentándolo hasta que crucemos.
Queremos darle una vida mejor a nuestro hijo o hija.
Es lo que hizo mi papá.
Those dialogues between them and Sean just seemed very cookie cutter, very headline to me. I want to say this with very carefully because I definitely acknowledge that these experiences, like people having to flee their homes because of safety, because of poverty, or other reasons, is very real. I'm not trying to deny that people risk their lives to come here and give a better life for their children and their family or themselves. They come here to work. And there are hard reasons why people come to the United States, and we're going to particularly be focusing on Mexico just because, you know, Sean and Daniel are Mexican American. I actually watched this documentary. It's called Living Undocumented. And even though Sean and Daniel aren't undocumented immigrants, and I don't know what Esteban is, two of the people they highlighted in this documentary, one of them was from Honduras and another one was from Mexico. And they were talking about their experience sort of living undocumented as immigrants in the United States in a post-Trump era. So I thought that's very relevant to sort of what Life is Strange 2 was sort of talking about. Some of the reasons that these people were leaving their homes were, again, was from poverty, from violence in the areas that they grew up in, and also just doing some general research about why people emigrate from Mexico to America. of some of those same reasons. So that's definitely a reality. However, this is sort of my complaint of this game not really showing nuance and sort of more sticking to headlines and more dramatic, flashy moments. I think it's important to, I guess, also recognize that economic powerhouses such as the United States can also put people in these complicated positions where they don't feel like they have a choice but to emigrate from their home country. So I make this point because oftentimes we associate countries that have a lot of black and brown people with a lot of times poverty and crime and the not good parts before we ever acknowledge these countries for their cultural and monetary richness. Not everybody who lives in Mexico necessarily wants to come to the United States or necessarily wants to leave their home. And also there's so many great things about being a Mexican American person and having Mexican heritage that I feel like games like this kind of fail to acknowledge when they just really focus in on this idea of we need to leave Mexico and America is the place of freedom and land and opportunity. And I just don't really agree with this sort of blanket poverty assumption when it comes to Mexico or any country that inhabits a lot of black and brown people, let's be honest. I think the reason I have an issue with this depiction is because I'm worried that this game could kind of come off as a white savior narrative, or at least this portrayal where the black and brown people, the poor black and browns, need to escape to, an economic superpower, the United States, the Western world, to be able to thrive and sort of enjoy life, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to discredit again the realities that some people really do need to come here to have a better life because they're escaping things that are harmful in their own country. And I may not be saying this perfectly, or I don't know, I might kind of be missing something in this, and that's where you guys, particularly y'all who are Mexican American and Latinx migrants, can help me respectfully in the comment section and help us process this better. But I don't want this game to come off, or this portrayal of Mexico to come off as if black and brown people always need to be saved. And again, saying that carefully because I know some people do need to be saved or safe from their home environment, but that's not indicative of the entire country as a whole. This is just kind of my complaint with the game never really showing nuance. And going off of that same idea, another thing that does not sit well with me is the depiction of the Diaz brothers if either of them make it across the border to Mexico. In my playthrough, Sean went to Mexico and Daniel stayed home, but I was watching some other people's Let's Plays, and also I watched all the different endings of the game, and what did not sit well with me is how the boys were shown to immediately have to take on this gangster sort of macho man persona if they make it to Mexico. And so that does not sit well with me because of this internalized idea of the adultification of black and brown boys already that we hold in society. I feel like sending Sean and Daniel to Mexico and then showing them as these gangsters that have to fight off these other gangsters, I feel like this just perpetuates a stereotype that we already hold about Mexico. And there's already this issue of adultifying black and brown children, which further dehumanizes these communities. Very rarely in media do we ever allow black and brown kids really just to be kids. And again, I do realize the story ages Sean and Daniel. That is part of the nature of this sort of coming of age story where all these traumatic things are happening to these boys. But even throughout the game, it was never a 180 switch of them all of a sudden being kind of scared on the run to them being these hard badass characters. That just does not sit right with me. And you can read up on more about adultification if you'd like to. Of course, all my sources are in the description, but I'm gonna read an excerpt from this nonprofit organization called Kids Imprisoned. I believe it's nonprofit. Correction, Kids Imprisoned is actually a reporting project created by journalism students across the United States. This specific study about kids in the criminal justice system was conducted in the year 2020. So here's a couple excerpts from that. The adultification of juveniles particularly affects youth of color. Assumptions about children of color are unfair, and minority kids feel that they can't just be kids. Black and Latino boys were more likely than white boys to be seen as older by law enforcement and legal actors. Hispanic youth on average are detained about 2 times more than white youth. So now I want to talk a little bit about the portrayal of the Mexican American identity. And again, this is going to have overlap with stuff we kind of already touched on, but I just really wished that this game depicted their Mexican American identity as not just a burden. It seems like to this game, what it means to be Mexican American to Sean and Daniel is to have people project their prejudice onto you and to speak Spanish, at least Sean. You learn at the end of the game that Daniel does not even speak Spanish, which was kind of surprising because they grew up in the same house. So I don't know how Sean learned how to speak Spanish fluently and Daniel did not, but anyways, but their Americanness or seemingly lack thereof is emphasized, which I definitely do appreciate, you know, to show that these people aren't foreigners, they're from America, they do things just like everybody else does. That's just that we want to see people of color being humanized in media, definitely. But because discrimination and them being attacked in the script and shamed for being Mexican American was shown so prevalently throughout this game, if that's even a word, I wish it would have balanced out the hate crimes with the great parts and the wonderful parts about being Mexican American and walking in their skin. The familial and cultural ties that Sean and Daniel have to their Mexican side seems to be slim to none, which is not, it's still a valid experience. I'm not going to say because they're Mexican, they're first generation Mexican American kids, they should have this one experience, because that's not true. Everybody's experience is different. But as first generation kids, this may not be as common of an experience. Rito's Gale also says, the game, in my opinion, did not depict a terribly stereotypical depiction of first-generation Mexican Americans, especially due to the fact that Sean and Daniel have a white mother, grew up in Seattle, and is essentially assimilated into American culture. In my opinion, it depicts a less common experience of a first-generation, evidence of that term, Mexican American, given that many of us still have personal connections to many cultural customs and traditions outside of language and race. Again, Rito's Gale, he is also a Mexican American and a first-generation American citizen, so know that for context. And here's another quote from Patricia Hernandez, again the person who wrote the Polygon article. They're also a first-generation Mexican American US citizen, and they say, to be a first-generation kid is to carry the weight of a family who has given everything up so I can have a chance. It is becoming alien to those same people as I slowly forget my native tongue. It is being terrified to ask my mom what career she dreamed of when she was a child, before she was pulled out of school to work full-time. It is suffocating under the knowledge that she's crossed the border not once, not twice, but 3 times, including one time to save me from abduction. We don't really talk about these things. Some stories I'm afraid to know in full. The scraps I know of have been enough. The border is a series of fractures. And I wish that this game would have just had more of this internal dialogue of Sean and Daniel and their Mexican American identity. Do Sean and Daniel feel that they're Mexican enough living in Seattle? Especially Daniel, because we learned that he doesn't speak Spanish. Just how does that affect his identity? Are they Mexican enough to fit into Puerto Lobos? Do they feel American enough to fit into Seattle? How are they processing this? How has being a Mexican American, first generation Mexican American citizen affected their lives before versus after the blast? How has this changed? Are the attacks anything new? Because if so, I feel like they should have more of a reaction to them when they happen. And if the boys make it to Mexico, is Mexico truly even their home? They've grown up in America their whole lives, and they seemingly don't have any cultural or familial ties. So how are they processing that? Let's go ahead and contradict this idea for a moment, because again, I want to be a good researcher and show you things from multiple sides. One of the persons in my community, JB, he writes, I've seen so many people who could resonate with how Sean and Daniel and their heritage was portrayed. I've read reactions to how Esteban reminded people of their own father, how the Diaz family dynamic was relatable, even the harder aspects. I've also seen people who felt like it was a stereotypical and exaggerated. So those are some differing opinions of how people have reacted to this game, especially those people who are Mexican American or a Latinx immigrant in the United States. Some people really liked it and resonated with it and liked how it wasn't too exaggerated or cliche. You know, we don't want exaggerations or caricatures, but I just wish there was a little bit more depiction of their actual Mexican heritage, even in like the music they listen to, foods they have around the house, just like the little details to show that Mexican and being Mexican American is not just a burden, but there are lovely things about it as well. And this is another quote from Natalie Flores. This person is a Latinx immigrant in the United States. I don't know specifically if she is Mexican American, but this is a quote she wrote in an article she wrote for Paste magazine. Sean and Daniel Diaz, Latin American children of immigrants who are simultaneously invisible and hypervisible in Trump's America. As a result, it has deeply affected someone like me, a bisexual Latin American, who is the daughter of an immigrant. and thus is constantly prone to invisibility and erasure. Life is Strange 2 captures that specific feeling of invisibility and hypervisibility as a Latinx person perfectly, and in the process has given me the most validating experience I've had in video games. So again, we have people who love the depiction of being Mexican American and like that depiction of their experiences being discriminated against in the United States. And we also have people who feel like there could have been more. So in essence, I don't like the stereotypical Mexico is dangerous sort of narrative they painted with some dialogues, like even with the depiction of like, if the boys make it to Mexico, them being like gangsters and sort of having to fend for themselves. Don't like that adultification. Feeds into this idea of Mexico as a place of, you know, drug cartels and criminals, and enforces this stereotypical depiction. I do wish Sean and Daniel were able to define more of their Mexican American identities for themselves beyond just speaking Spanish or Sean just speaking Spanish, because there's so much to being a part of an identity group than just your language and your struggles, you know? And because they wanted to emphasize the struggles, I wish there was more balance of the cultural ties and the good parts, for lack of better words, you know, about being Mexican American, being born in brown skin. But I also do like how this game also brought validity to some of the harsh realities of being a Mexican American or Latinx immigrants. I do like that they showed that families being separated at the border with Carla and Diego, because that's something that really happens and is a reality for people, unfortunately. I like how they showed that work, better opportunity, family, and safety are reasons people risk their lives to come here, even illegally. So now we're going to end more on a positive note and sort of wrap it up with this idea of belonging. I feel like Life is Strange 2 was broke down into two sections, this idea of being excluded, the other, discriminated against, but also finding belonging. And as the Diaz brothers are on the run, searching for their home, they really come to find that home is where trust resides. Something that is a big theme of Life is Strange 2 is this idea of belonging in brotherhood and growing together as brothers. As homeless people who are Mexican American and the world sees them as that and labels them as that in a post-Trump America, these boys must find trust in people to be safe. That becomes home for them. So with Brody, they find trust in Captain Spirit or Chris. They find trust in their mom eventually, if you take that path. They find trust in the drifters and in the commune. They find trust in each other. This game is about defining home, trust, family, and belonging in unconventional ways. It's about looking out for the other and making the invisible visible. And it's about growing through grief, trauma, and mourning the loss of what was. Childhood, innocence, normalcy, safety. That is just what I think about Life is Strange 2 and the way they decided to tackle some of these socio-cultural issues. The biggest ones I discussed in this video and I went deeper into was how they depicted, you know, discrimination, being othered, homelessness, how they depicted Mexico, the Mexican identity, emigration and immigration. And so these are definitely topics that are seldom talked about in media and especially not in video games. Video games tackling real world issues, just like other forms of media, is relatively new. You know, traditionally we've seen video games as a place of escape, but video games becoming more culturally relevant with, you know, what's happening. It's telling of the times. We can't exclude forms of media to talk about these difficult subjects. And so I do appreciate how Life is Strange brought humanity to these Mexican American boys and told this story unapologetically in a way that video games aren't often known for doing. So I appreciate Life is Strange 2 for taking that risk and being bold in that. Of course, this game was clumsy. There are ways they definitely could have improved. I feel like definitely taking people from the experience and examining the Mexican American experience with a Mexican American writer or a Latinx writer or an immigrant writer to have more of that internal dialogue, that internal conflict, and more deeper, meaningful exploration of what it is like to be dehumanized, specifically for the color of your skin or the ethnicity you were born into, the body you were born into. They could have done more exploration of that to make the game more believable and relatable, especially for their audience. Yeah, I said this earlier, but Life is Strange 2's fan base are not these overt racist aggressors and attackers. And so instead of showing these few people as the antagonists, I wish they would have sort of emphasized how structures of power and security, which I believe are the real antagonists of this game, I wish they would have shown how we all contribute and how it's a systemic collective issue of this world. Again, this game came out pre-2020, I'm gonna say. So at the time, like, there really wasn't much dialogue about this. And so I understand that. But again, I think it would have been beneficial to have people of color, Latinx people, Mexican American people on the team sort of writing about these experiences. And I think we would have seen more of those nuances and complexities and more further exploration of these issues beyond Life is Strange 2's just sort of surface level acknowledgement that they exist. So I'm definitely much more critical about the way people of color are depicted in media when we do get to see ourselves. It's not every day that we get to see a story about an experience that is familiar to us. It shouldn't be like that, but that's just, you know, our reality. I'm critical of these sort of things because I think it's important to think about race critically and media and how media affects our prejudices and how it either perpetuates them or debunks them. Because although it's a fictional story, it's obviously talking about real world issues, and I don't want somebody to get the wrong idea from a game like this, you know? So I know this video was long, and everything I mentioned in this recording is definitely not going to make it into the final edit. So if you are a Monarch member, I recently opened up YouTube channel memberships. There's information in the description box below about what my perks are and how you can join. But one of the things I am going to do if you are a Monarch member is we're going to continue this conversation. I'm going to share some clips that did not make it into the final cut of this video because I know I make long videos, but believe it or not, I still can't put everything in here. So I'm going to share some clips that I didn't include in here and also be talking about some minor social issues and themes that Life is Strange 2 explores that I didn't get to talk about here today. And just, you know, overall conversing and finalizing this discussion, well, not finalizing, but continuing this discussion about Life is Strange 2 and its various exploration of social issues. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, leave your comments, your thoughts in the description down below. Of course, be respectful, be gracious, be kind. Gaslighting comments will be clapped, like I said earlier. And let's just continue this conversation. How do you think about the way Life is Strange 2 decided to depict racism, xenophobia, the Mexican American experience and identity, emigration, immigration? Let me know, what do you think about how the developers tackle these social issues? My name is Mara, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, everyone.